In what is currently the most viewed video on my channel, I said the following. Now, I get it. There are some stinkers in the franchise, and this is his subjective opinion. For every Godzilla's Revenge, we have Shin Godzilla. For every Ebirah Horror of the Deep, we have GMK Giant Monsters All-Out Attack. Now, what was initially just a throwaway comment in a drama video attracted a ton of comments calling me out. For example, one commenter said, "What is that supposed to mean? Ebirah Horror of the Deep was actually really good. My brother, who is a way bigger Godzilla fan than me, made me watch it with him, and I actually thought it was pretty good, and at some points funny." While another commenter said, "I know I'm late to this, but I will not stand for Ebirah Horror of the Deep slander." Some even went as far as to try and gatekeep and say I wasn't a real Godzilla fan by saying, hating on Son of Godzilla and Ebirah Horror of the Deep / Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster is like not understanding what Godzilla is. Which, if you know anything about me or this channel, that's a really dumb thing to say, considering that I've been a Godzilla fan for as long as I've been a sentient human being. I do think that the idea of even criticizing a Godzilla movie means you don't understand Godzilla. It's just a stupid mindset. You should be free to criticize something if you don't like it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do here. You see, Ebirah Horror of the Deep, or Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, is my least favorite Godzilla movie, and yes, that means I hate it more than this movie, and this one, and especially whatever the hell this was supposed to be. In order to fully explain why I have such a strong disdain for this movie, we need to first explain how this project even came to fruition. Let's go back to the magical year of 1966. Walt Disney died, 117 passengers died when an Air India Boeing 707 crashed into Mont Blanc, and worst of all, Ebirah Horror of the Deep was put into production by Toho. But at first, it wasn't even going to feature Godzilla. You see, Toho planned to make a new King Kong movie before their licensing deal with RKO expired in 1967. Originally titled Operation Robinson Crusoe, King Kong vs. Ebirah, the film was meant to be a collaboration with Rankin Bass, who had just launched the King Kong show.
King Kong, 10 times as big as a man.
However, creative differences derailed the partnership. Toho insisted on Jun Fukuda as director and Sadamasa Arikawa for special effects, while Rankin Bass wanted Ishiro Honda and Eiji Tsuburaya. Unable to reach a compromise, Rankin Bass ended up walking away from the project. And this marked the very first Godzilla film to not feature Eiji Tsuburaya as the special effects director. In fact, it would be his last, as he would end up passing away on January 25th, 1970 at the age of 68. Rather than scrap the project, Toho reworked the script, replacing King Kong with Godzilla. This then became a script titled Godzilla, Ebirah, Mothra, Big Duel in the South Seas. After some further revisions, the script became what we now know as Ebirah Horror of the Deep. Stranded on Letchi Island, Ryota and his friends discover the Red Bamboo, a terrorist group enslaving infant island natives to produce a substance that keeps the sea monster Ebirah at bay. In their search for help, they awaken a dormant Godzilla using a makeshift lightning rod, leading to a fierce battle where Godzilla forces Ebirah to retreat with his atomic breath. As Mothra arrives to rescue the captives, the Red Bamboo trigger a self-destruct mechanism, setting the island on a countdown to destruction. In a final underwater clash, Godzilla defeats Ebirah and, after some hesitation, escapes into the ocean just as the island explodes, leaving the survivors to celebrate their narrow escape. My biggest issue with Ebirah Horror of the Deep is that it has what I consider to be the outright worst characterization of Godzilla. Yes, it's worse than the 1998 Godzilla. Now, you might be wondering, how can I even say that when the 98 Godzilla was so wildly out there that Toho literally rebranded that iteration of the character into a separate creature called Zilla. They then, of course, famously killed it off in 13 seconds in Godzilla Final Wars. Now, on the surface, the Godzilla that appears in Ebirah Horror of the Deep looks the part. He's got that classic Showa-era design, but looks can be deceiving. Like I mentioned before, this movie was originally written with King Kong in mind, but the filmmakers pivoted to Godzilla. And like I said, this wasn't some deeply thought-out creative shift. It was a quick fix, a practical decision that was driven by rights issues and production constraints. And while the surface level elements were swapped out, like Godzilla replacing Kong in the action scenes, the character dynamics and narrative beats remained largely unchanged. As a result, Godzilla ends up acting in ways that feel inherently un-Godzilla-like. Like Godzilla being in love with a human woman, a trope that thankfully was never revisited in the franchise. We all know Kong has a track record of simping over women, whether it be Fay Wray, Jessica Lange, or Naomi Watts. Even in the Japanese-produced King Kong Escapes, Kong is depicted as being infatuated with Linda Miller's character. And in Kong's case, this dynamic works really well. It works because it emphasizes the central tragedy of Kong's character, a creature of immense power and size who is ultimately vulnerable because of his emotional attachment. Kong's tragedy is rooted in the fact that his love for these women makes him an outsider in both the human and natural worlds. He doesn't belong in civilization, nor does he fully belong in the untamed wild. His connection to these women becomes both his strength and his downfall. As Carl Denham says,
"It was beauty killed the beast."
Godzilla doesn't work in that role because his tragedy is entirely different. Godzilla's core is rooted in being a force of nature, an embodiment of humanity's hubris, and the consequences of tampering with powers beyond our control. Whether he's portrayed as an unstoppable menace or an anti-hero or Captain Planet, Godzilla's emotional depth comes from his indifference to humanity and not his attachment to it. He's tragic in the way that a hurricane or an earthquake is tragic. The idea of Godzilla forming a romantic or protective bond with a human woman feels not only out of character, but borderline absurd. And with King Kong, that's still kind of gross. I'm not a big fan of that, but I think that it works with the story that they're trying to tell. But with Godzilla, it's really gross. It's like Rule 34 tier stuff. I don't like it. Godzilla's presence in a film should evoke a sense of awe. Even when he's portrayed as a hero, he's never a warm or relatable figure. He's a towering ancient force with motivations and instincts that are alien to humanity. Sure, there were later movies in the Showa era that had him outright be a defender of humanity, but in Ebirah Horror of the Deep, the romantic subplot reduces Godzilla to something much smaller and more pedestrian than he ever should be. It diminishes his mythic quality and robs him of the symbolic weight that he carries as a walking nuclear metaphor. Furthermore, Godzilla's behavior throughout the movie feels like it was written with Kong's character in mind. Moments that might have felt natural for Kong, like being distracted by a beautiful woman or being coaxed into action by lightning, feel jarring and nonsensical when applied to Godzilla. This isn't just a case of a poorly written subplot, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what Godzilla represents. Kong's character is built on emotional vulnerability, while Godzilla's character is built on imposing indifferent power. That's why they work so well together when they're in the same movie. You can't just swap one for the other without the entire thematic foundation collapsing. Now, there are other nitpicks I could make too, like how this movie contradicts King Kong vs. Godzilla. In that movie, lightning was explicitly shown to be Godzilla's weakness, yet in Ebirah Horror of the Deep, it's lightning that wakes him up. Continuity, however, was never exactly this franchise's strong suit, especially in the Showa era. I mean, just look at Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, where he's struck by lightning and then he's powered up by that and he becomes a magnet. I mean, really, that type of stuff doesn't matter. The Showa era movies often prioritized spectacle and entertainment over internal consistency, which, to be fair, is part of their charm. In fact, that's what I love about the majority of these movies. But Godzilla's love for a human woman isn't just a nitpick, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of Godzilla's character. It's not just weird, it's wrong in a way that makes Ebirah Horror of the Deep feel like it was stitched together with leftover scraps from a Kong script, which it was. I mean, you can practically see the seams where Godzilla was retrofitted into a role that he was never meant to play. And for a character as iconic and thematically rich as Godzilla, that's a pretty big misstep. Godzilla is a versatile character. In fact, I would go as far as to say that he is the most versatile character in all of fiction, but this is one of the rare instances where it just flat out doesn't work. Beyond the mischaracterization of Godzilla, the story of Ebirah Horror of the Deep has almost zero stakes. Sure, the human characters are trapped on an island controlled by a terrorist group, but the plot never actually goes anywhere. Events just sort of happen for the sake of filling runtime with little to no narrative momentum or tension. The characters' actions feel inconsequential, and the supposed threat looming over them lacks any real weight or urgency. The island setting, which is visually distinct from the usual cityscapes or rural countryside of the franchise, ends up feeling small and contained rather than isolating or threatening. This lack of stakes extends to the kaiju action as well, which is some of the most lackluster in the entire Godzilla series. The majority of the clashes between Godzilla and Ebirah revolve around the two monsters just throwing around a rock as if it were a volleyball. It's repetitive, uninspiring, and quickly becomes mind-numbingly boring. There's no sense of escalation, no creative choreography, and no memorable set pieces. For a franchise known for grandiose monster brawls, Ebirah Horror of the Deep feels shockingly low energy. Ebirah as a villain doesn't do the film any favors either. As a giant lobster, he's visually unremarkable and conceptually uninspired. He lacks any meaningful personality, presence, or thematic resonance. I generally dislike kaiju that are just a pre-existing animal but big, and Ebirah is one of the clearest examples of this. There's no twist or unique characterization to make him stand out beyond his crustacean design. Even when he reappeared as a supporting villain in 2004's Godzilla Final Wars, it was more of a secondary role, which is honestly where he works best. Having him as the main villain of your movie is just a massive misstep, even though he's being controlled by the terrorists and they're more the bigger enemies, but still, I stand by my point. And then there's the infamous giant condor fight. This battle is notoriously remembered as one of the worst in the entire Godzilla franchise, and it's not hard to see why. The choreography is clumsy, the editing is disorienting, and the entire encounter feels like it was cobbled together as an afterthought. It comes out of nowhere and has no relevance on the plot. Half the time, it's difficult to tell what's even happening on screen. It's the kind of scene that feels like it belongs in a parody of a Godzilla film rather than an actual entry in the franchise. Beyond the kaiju action, Akira Takarada gives a very charismatic performance as per usual. He's doing the best he can with what he's given, and Yoshimura, while not the most memorable Godzilla character, stands out as one of the film's few highlights. The film's score by Masaru Sato is another genuine bright spot. It stands out from Akira Ifukube's iconic compositions with this twangy beach-inspired vibe that perfectly complements the film's tropical setting and lighter tone. Over the years, many have compared Sato's score to the style of classic James Bond soundtracks, and it's an apt comparison. The jazzy flourishes and energetic melodies inject much-needed personality into scenes that might otherwise fall flat. I'd even go so far as to say that the score is one of the few elements of Ebirah Horror of the Deep that truly excels. Now would be a good time to talk about the American dub, since that is the version of the film that I grew up watching, and it's not the best. In fact, it's downright terrible.
There goes our boat!
The American version had a few changes, like removing some scenes, renaming characters, like turning Captain Ryui into Commander Yamamoto, and rearranging some footage. A new soundtrack was made as a lot of the original scenes and music were cut. In general, the dub is not the greatest. Gone are the days of having respected voice acting names like Paul Frees involved, and now we're treated to whoever the distribution studios could find. It signals the future of Godzilla dubs coming from America, where everything is just sort of quickly thrown together to make a quick buck, much like this very film. In short, Ebirah Horror of the Deep isn't just a bad Godzilla film, it's a bad movie in general. The film's director, Jun Fukuda, later admitted that he really hated the project and wasn't proud of it. He went as far as to describe his experience rewatching this film as opening up an old wound. Fukuda has actually gone on record to state that he pretty much hates every Godzilla movie he's ever made. In an interview with Dave Milner from 1994, Fukuda was asked which monster movies of his were his favorites, and he simply answered, none of them. Now, in my personal opinion, I think that Ebirah Horror of the Deep is the worst Godzilla movie that Jun Fukuda ever made, but the rest of his entries in the franchise are actually really good. As a filmmaker myself, I'm hypercritical of everything I've ever made, so I completely understand where he's coming from. Still, Ebirah Horror of the Deep is a deeply flawed movie, and it utterly fails at being a good Godzilla story. It fundamentally misuses the character in some really egregious ways. It's a film that is wildly different from all previous entries in the worst way imaginable. However, it ended up functioning as a prototype of sorts for some of Jun Fukuda's future Godzilla movies that are leagues better than this one. In general, this is a movie that has a lot of potential, and I would like to see a remake of it. Like, it's one of the few Showa movies where I'd be like, yeah, let's remake it, let's give it a try, let's see what we can do under different circumstances. But as of right now, it is, in my opinion, the worst Godzilla movie ever made. And with all of that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick, you're watching Firewind Media. This is part 7 of my massive Godzilla retrospective project. If you're new to the channel, go and watch the first 6 parts. I also covered the MonsterVerse Godzilla movies, so feel free to go check those out as well. I just dropped my 4th feature film, The Anomalous Archives, which is a horror anthology project with some kaiju in it, some demon cow monsters that I'm just incredibly proud of. So if you like Godzilla, then that might be your jam. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.